One. Well, hello and welcome to the Profit Express. I'm Tim Healy, and I'm inviting you to join me each and every Wednesday so together we can win the battle for business. That's right. We do it here and only here on the Profit Express. So as always, hey, thanks for sharing some of your time with me today, and thanks for being on board. Now, I've been very fortunate to have interviewed many founders on the journey of the Profit Express over the years. And I will always want to interview the founder of a company, of a product and a service, over the CEO or the president. Why? Well, that's pretty obvious. It is the founder who's the real story. It is the founder who is often that creative genius who has identified this big problem in the marketplace, and they have a great product or solution that is poised to eat up a whole bunch of market share. And it's their passion and enthusiasm that gets them to build that initial team to follow them on that journey. But the interesting part with so many founders is those original characteristics of the creative genius, of the passion and enthusiasm that got them launching off the ground will not allow them to scale successfully. Because believe it or not, as much as a lot of founders can exercise and exhibit some great characteristics, they also exhibit a lot of not so great characteristics that can run them off the rails. So as much as they can be creative and inspiring, they could have a really hard time at delegation, execution, or building relationships. So that's where today's duo of guests come in. That's right. We have an interesting lineup of guests. It is an actual founder and a coach of founders, and they've come together in a collaboration that's been brewing and building over the last 15 years. And they are the co-founders of this book, as you can see right here, Founders Keepers, Why Founders Are Built to Fail and What It Takes to Succeed. Now, a little bit of the backstory. It was the venture capitalist Peter Fenton, who introduced the founder, Tzuo, who is the founder of Zuora, which, for those of you who don't know, is the leading platform for subscription billing and revenue. And the venture capitalist Peter Fenton knew at this point in Tien's journey he needed help, like so many other founders. And that's when Rich came into the picture. Rich Hagberg, who is a trained psychologist, and at the time was coaching executives to kind of help them travel and ascend the corporate ladder of success. Well, Peter Fenton knew Tien needed help, introduced him to Rich. And in the book, Rich had said, and it was mentioned, that Tien was the first real odd duck profile he ever dealt with. And that's when he kind of dove deep into the world of coaching and helping founders. And so here we are today. And the reason I'm very excited, first of all, it's a great read. It's an excellent read. And I know I have a lot of my own clients who are founders, and a lot of listeners and fans of the show are founders. So it's a great pleasure to have on both Tzuo, again, he's the founder of Zuora, and Rich Hagberg, the founder of Hagberg Consulting Group. Gentlemen, how are you today?
Good. Thank you for having us.
Hey, pleasure.
Good.
Now, let me do this. So it's not often that I have co-authors on the show, but given the fact that one is the founder, well, you're both founders. Rich, I know you're a founder as well, but then one is the coach. I think, you know what? That's an interesting dynamic that I think could make for a great conversation. So I'm fortunate and very thankful you guys made the time. So let me jump in deep into the book. Tien, let me first go to you. I'm going to quote the page 128 of the book. You recall the meeting between you and Rich when Rich delivered your weaknesses in excruciating detail. Let me start with that. What was that meeting like? What was it like for you as a founder hearing your weaknesses?
Look, in the luxury of hindsight, it was certainly a pivotal point in my personal development, in my growth. I remember at the time, it's hard, right? It's hard, and it's hard to realize that you are the problem. We were hitting a time in the company where, my team was telling me, "Hey, we don't have values. The left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. The management seems to be in an ivory tower." And the realization that Rich really helped me understand was I was part of the problem, that I was at the root of it. It was how I managed, it was how I led. And the amazing thing about Rich's structure, which is what we try to bring in the book, is a framework behind it. There's data behind it. And Rich was able to show how my personality was linked to my leadership style. And so there was no escape, right? I couldn't externalize this. I couldn't blame anything else. But that realization really began the journey of self-improvement. And, 15 years later, we're still here. We're still running the company. And I owe a lot of this really to the work that Rich did in that moment where he laid down the truth.
Was it a test to your ego, Tien?
It was absolutely a test to the ego, certainly. And so, Rich tells me not everybody survives that challenge, that gauntlet. But Rich was equal amounts of firmness, clarity, and just handled it really, really well and helped guide me through it.
Beautiful, beautiful. So now, Rich, tell us your first impressions of Tien.
I thought he was probably a little scary. I think a lot of founders I think a lot of founders are pretty forceful people. And, when you're the boss, it's pretty hard to tell the emperor he's got no clothes. And so many founders are intimidating. And what happens is people tell them what they want to hear as a result. But he was a bit scary, and his number two guy was a bit scary. And but when you take a look at the personality test, and I went over that with him, and it actually predicts the 360, predicts how his colleagues will see him, and I went over that. He was very receptive to it. He asked lots of questions, and I think like a lot of founders believe data. I had one founder say to me, when you, the shrink, tell me I'm insensitive, I could say, what do you know? You're a shrink. But when 24 of my peers, superiors, subordinates tell me I'm insensitive, and they write a page and a half of comments, I listen.
That's exactly right.
So he was a bit scary, but he was at least open to the message you had to share.
Yeah, that's right. The thing about founders is there are some founders who are guided by their ego, and they don't want to hear anything that contradicts the view they have of themselves. Right. And there are other founders, and our successful founders in studying successful versus unsuccessful really showed that the successful ones want to learn and they want to grow. One of the most interesting findings we got was one of the items on the personality test is I frequently reflect upon my strengths and weaknesses, or past successes and failures is actually how it's worded. Mm-hmm. And the successful founders said strongly agree to that statement, and the unsuccessful said strongly disagree. And that's pretty telling. That says, if you have a desire to increase your self-awareness and to learn, you're going to have a chance.
So it kind of begins with the self-awareness. If they're closed off to that, your effectiveness as a coach won't be nearly what it could be.
Yep. Yeah. And in fact, I studied about, after I've been doing this about 15 or 16 years, I looked at those people who either quit the program or I fired. And they all had one characteristic, which was really interesting. They were actually two characteristics. They were low on listening and high on self-confidence. So they were sure they were right.
Yeah, okay, so you just set me up for a perfect segue, Rich. Tien, in the book, there's this quote that really caught my attention. And you suggested going into a meeting, telling yourself you're only allowed to ask questions and not make any declarative statements. And you say in the book, it felt like pulling teeth, but it opened you up into new insights for you. And Rich just mentioned listening. So that to me was again, it caught my attention. Why was that so important for you, Tien?
Well, Rich talked about these two things, right? Some self-confidence and ability to listen. And, those very well described founders, right? I mean, you start with this idea that you have in your head. Lots of people in the world are telling you it can't be done, this isn't right. And through stubbornness, through belief, through an irrational level of self-confidence, you plow through it. And so that is what we try to touch on in the book, that the aspects that make you a great founder are ultimately the seeds of your destruction. And so in going through this, you've got to face down these things and you've got to overcome a lot of your default natures. So when I got my list of development areas, and some of them are the chapters in the book, it was not necessarily natural for me to solve some of these things. One of them was openness to input. I got a lot of feedback that I didn't listen. And my team felt like I was not open to input because I was just more focused on my vision and what I was trying to drive through. So Rich and I talked about it, and I was like, look, if you really want to listen, you have to listen. You have to listen. You have to play back what people are hearing. And so to put myself in the proper posture, I just said, let me just ask questions. I'm not allowed to evangelize. I'm not allowed to browbeat. I'm not allowed to just pontificate or give stump speeches. I literally just had to ask questions. And I don't know that 100% of my statements were questions, but it definitely put that awareness level in me. And look, the first question it's not too hard, but then you have to follow up with another question. You have to follow up with another question. And it definitely pretty soon, it starts to feel a little odd. But forcing myself to do that, I probably did this off and on for weeks, if not months. You start to improve your listening skills, right? You start to improve your listening skills, and the feedback from my team was definitely, hey, there's been a market change in what he's like in these meetings.
Did that strategy have a trickle down effect? Did your management team adapt that strategy as well?
One of the things that I think, with Rich's work is you try to hire people that are different. Rich talked about my number two was probably too similar to me. And so
also scary.
The founders felt if you hire well, they're going to have a different set of things, right? They're going to have a different set of things that are to balance you. I think the more biggest impactful is they felt more open. They opened up. People were talking about their points, and learning to listen. I also learned to facilitate. So I would say, hey, before we move off this topic, what I heard was this person said this statement or this question. What do you think about that? Right? That was a question. So I was allowed to say that. And so the teamwork, which is another one of my development areas, really started to blossom when I was able to take more of a facilitator role instead of a leader role that would just sort of suck all the oxygen out of the room.
So you both have mentioned it. What makes leaders great can also be part of the downfall. I would think that you can't be a great founder getting something off the ground without a very healthy ego. Is that fair to say? Which goes hand in hand with confidence. When does the ego start to trip? And I'll throw it out to either one of you. When does the ego? What are the first signs that ego trips up a founder?
I think when your need to be right and win the argument is stronger than your need for facts and alternatives, because good decisions are made when people feel comfortable suggesting alternatives that might differ from yours or disagree with yours. And when you focus on facts, and I think for a lot of founders, I guess the realization is that nobody's pushing back when they say, does anybody have concerns? And nobody says anything. Or people appear to be reluctant to be open. If there's not psychological safety and your behavior doesn't invite input, then all of a sudden you're asking for their reactions and you're getting silence.
Psychological
safety. Yeah, let me say one other thing.
Yeah, go ahead.
And that is, when you make a bad decision, a really bad decision, and you reflect on that, and it dawns on you that maybe you drove that decision too hard and didn't ask for people who saw what you didn't see, who saw what the risks were or what could go wrong. I encourage people to ask what are called disconfirming questions. And a disconfirming question would be, if this project were to fail, why would it fail? What's your biggest concern about this? What am I not considering? What assumptions do I have that maybe need to be challenged? If we were to take my idea and run with it, what could go wrong?
I like that.
Yeah, Rich, look, the book is chock full of techniques like this that are practical and very useful, and that's a technique I definitely used. There's a chapter in the book that we call the myth of the genius jerk, and I remember having discussions and debates with Rich over the years, because there's almost especially in Silicon Valley, this ethos that a founder has to be very strong. It has to be egocentric. It has to be like a Steve Jobs, where you're throwing chairs at people or whatnot. And we really wanted to dispel that myth, because that's simply going to propagate the problem. That's going to propagate the issue. And behind every story of a Steve Jobs, people forget there's a second half of the story, right? There's a story where he did get fired from Apple. He did go through a self-learning. He did have a failure in his company Next that actually humbled him. There was a very, very different Steve Jobs that came in for Apple's second act. And without that humbleness, I don't think he could have accomplished what he did and empowered people like a Johnny Ives or a Tim Cook and created the amazing innovations. And so our goal was really to say, look, you have to really understand yourself, right? Create that room for self-awareness, and don't buy into the myth that you can just stay, an egocentric, narcissistic founder and believe that you can actually succeed in the long run, because it's actually not true.
And it was something
let me add to that. Let me add to that.
Go ahead.
Oops, I'm sorry.
No, it's all right. Go ahead.
I was going to say, this whole notion of founder mode, which is based on Paul Graham's, speech, sort of gives founders permission to be genius jerks. And what we found, we looked at 122 founders, where we had both multiple of invested capital data. So how successful were they in the returns to the shareholders? We looked at the people who got a 10x return versus the people who got zip. And we looked at what their characteristics were. And those characteristics don't match up with the few high-profile people that people look at, like Jobs or Musk, et cetera. And it showed that they were more open to input, that they were better at working through people and teams, that they were willing to delegate, and they were willing to work through people, and that they put systems and processes in place, and that they had better self-awareness, and they were less reactive, and they didn't micromanage. And one of the things about founder mode that was propagated is that founders, it's okay to micromanage. Well, there may be times when you need to dive into something to figure out what's going on and there's a problem. But if you do that, if there's a steady diet of that, not only are you going to alienate people, you're going to disempower people, and the good ones will leave, especially when you grow and you bring in people who have experience and knowledge. And those people won't stand to be micromanaged.
Rich, let me take a step back. I think it's important. I want to make sure the listeners get this. It's one of the keys in the book. Could you share with us the key leadership competencies that differentiate the successful from the unsuccessful founder?
Yeah, well, that's basically what I did, but let me go a little further.
Yeah.
The first one is adaptability. And it's important because startups are hard and they're demanding. And it's a survival of the fittest kind of a place. And you never have permanent product market fit. And you're going to have to adapt. And you're going to have to adapt not only how you manage, but how you lead. And so that means that dominating decisions, dominating meetings is going to get in your way. The second thing is you've got to bring in talent, and you've got to empower that talent. You need to work through that talent. If you're making all the decisions, not only are you going to be a decision roadblock, but you're going to burn out. And founder burnout is a big deal.
How common is that? How common is founder burnout?
Oh, it's I'd say it's an epidemic. I wrote a blog this morning on LinkedIn on founder burnout. It's in my Founders Keepers newsletter. So that's
interesting. So it's Rich. So it's an epidemic. You just wrote a blog on it. Tien, have you been a victim? Have you experienced founders burnout?
Well, I absolutely. That being said, I think I did have a chance to work for Mark Benioff, right, founder of Salesforce. I was there for the first 9 years of the company, and I did see how he was able to find balance. And so even early on, I had we had our daughter early, in the first year the company was around, and so taking quarterly weeks off, being able to step away from the company. Right. You always think about your company as a founder 24/7, right? But being able to be present with your family, right? Things to pull you aside. I remember I had a session with a younger founder, right? Had an opportunity to mentor younger founders. And I remember we sat down for one of our quarterly get-togethers, and I was just looking at his face and seeing the level of stress. And we said, look, let's just go for a long walk. And I wound up steering the conversation towards, hey, what do you do for fun? He's married now, but at the time it's like, well, are you dating anybody? Are you seeing anybody? And he was working 24/7, literally 7 days a week. And so just reminding him that says, oh, you got to go develop some side hobbies, get yourself out there. The funny thing is he was married like a year later. The founders can move fast, but that was impactful, right? And just being able to lift up, step away for once in a while. You have to have that perspective. If you burn out, it's not going to help you. It's not going to help your company. It's not going to help your vision. It's certainly not going to help your family. And you just have to know that.
There's so many interesting parts to this book and to your message. I might be jumping around a little bit, guys, and so I apologize. One of the things you mentioned earlier, you talked about how there was a certain profile or perception of who the founder should be, arrogant, hard pushing, narcissistic, all of those things. And the venture capitalists bought into that, and they kind of perpetuated that. Is part of your book's mission to dispel that?
Yeah, it sure is. Well, but we didn't start out to dispel it. I mean, you got to let the facts win. That's one thing I try to teach founders, that you have to let the facts win. And there were things in the book that emerged from the data. We have all this personality data, 50 different traits. We have all this 360 data, 46 different competencies we looked at. And out of that data came the insights. And sometimes it wasn't what we were looking for. In fact, one of the things that came up as a factor that was statistically significant in differentiating was systems and processes. Now, the successful founders, all founders tend to see system and process as bureaucracy, and they're allergic to structure. But the successful ones were at least average. The unsuccessful ones waited for things to break, and they saw it as bureaucracy. They saw efficiency as bureaucracy. We didn't figure that one out until last, probably August, when I went into the comments on the 360, and there it was. They waited for things to break over and over again. That statement in different forms was there. We weren't looking for that.
So again, look, I've been working with Rich with this framework. You can see it's a very sophisticated framework. There's 46 different leadership competencies. So you can imagine there's 46 skills that to be, the ideal leader, you've got to learn. And there's 100-something personality aspects as well. Now, I've been doing this for myself. So I've had this framework to help me manage myself. And I also put some of my leaders through Rich's structure as well. But when Rich approached me, I think it was 2-3 years ago, to say, hey, I'm thinking about writing this book. And I have all this data with thousands and thousands of leaders and, hundreds of founders. It was a great chance. One is I find his structure, his framework incredibly powerful, and to bring it to life and to really give it back to the folks in the community through this book was something that was pretty profound. But it was a really interesting experience. Like, we were diving into the data, right? Data mining, almost like architects or archaeologists, and just trying to understand, if there is this canonical profile of a founder. And we did see just a lot of consistent patterns that you can see the statistical correlations. One, in terms of what makes a founder different than a non-founder, what makes a successful founder different than an unsuccessful founder. What are the things that the investors and the executives in the company were looking for from their founder that perhaps the founder was not delivering? And we try to bring that to life. And that's, hopefully it's a gift for future founders to say, this is how you navigate it. Because if you don't, right, we use this metaphor for a ticking time bomb, where that's what founders are like. The success in the early days creates this ticking time bomb that time and time again causes them to blow up. And for the examples that we know, right, the Mark Zuckerbergs or whatnot that did not blow up, right, what were the techniques to their success, and can we bring that to life?
Let me talk about the 3 pillars of leadership for a second, because that really explains something really important for founders. When I did factor analysis back in the 80s on the data that I had on 360 to find out what leadership was really all about, it generated 3 different clusters of skill. We call that the visionary evangelist, think Steve Jobs, the relationship builder, think Indra Nooyi at Pepsi, and a whole bunch of other ones. And then managers of execution. So the relationship builders build loyalty, they get buy-in, they have good social skills, they have good EQ. The managers of execution are operators who make the trains run on time. They're structured, they're disciplined, they can be rigid, but they take the idea of the founder, the interesting insight that the founder had, and they make it into something that can be executed and implemented. And founders tend to be overwhelmingly visionary evangelists. The successful ones are a little above average on relationship building, but not enough. The unsuccessful ones are low on relationship building, but all founders, all are low on execution.
All?
Well, the average score for 122 founders was 1 standard deviation and a half below the mean on manager of execution. The successful ones were a little better.
Yeah. Okay.
But what the way I'd like to describe it is a visionary evangelist is really good at getting the rocket off the launch pad, but not very good at getting it into orbit. Certainly not very good at getting into the moon. And, if you're going to build a sustainable company, you better get it to Mars. And almost none of them have what it takes. So what you have to do is surround yourself with people who are managers of execution, whether that's the first one is usually an executive assistant, and then maybe a chief of staff, and then maybe a COO, or maybe you put managers of execution in key functions so that you've got a balance. And Tien has made a real effort to try and balance the team. And when it got out of balance, he brought in more of a different type. So it's very hard to do it all yourself. And if you're wired to be a creative, insightful person who energizes people and is a spokesperson for the company and raises money, chances are you're not going to be so good at managing the implementation and execution of your idea.
So it's the visionary, the relationship, and the execution as the pillars. So now, Tien, let me go back to you. What are you best at? What are you not so good at of those 3?
I'm clearly hands down visionary. I score probably 2 deviations above the mean, and most of the competencies that roll into that visionary pillar. Rich has a whole structure, right? There's 3 pillars, and each of them can be high, medium, low, and so there's 27 variations. I'm a high, medium, low, high vision, medium execution, probably slightly below medium, and low relationship. And so a lot of things that I had to work on was actually on that relationship dimension, team building, praise, building relationships, showing empathy, and things like that. And so it's certainly something I've had to learn. Hopefully my spouse actually appreciates it as well. But look, but on the execution side, I'm medium execution probably because I have worked at companies, larger companies. I've worked at Oracle, I worked at Salesforce, so I certainly appreciate execution at scale. A lot of founders sometimes, bypass that. Founders sometimes I know it's the first company they created right out of school. But look, just as an example, in our internal meetings, I try to be disciplined about labeling. Okay, is this an operational meeting, or is this a strategy meeting, right? Because if I'm in my visionary mode, or I just want to go in and I want to question things and I want to understand things, I can be highly, highly disruptive to an operational meeting. And so just understanding these meetings, and when I'm participating in an operational meeting, one, I can ask myself, do I really need to be here, right? If it's important, how do I take a little bit of a backseat on that? And how do I make sure that there's other meetings where I get to, do the things that I feel like I need to do and add to and help the company. But just being really clear about these things and making sure, okay, operating meetings, let's let other people run those meetings. Lets me make sure that I'm aligned to them and they understand what's important to me, but really trust them to manage the operations and execution of whatever part of the company is, right, that they're running.
That was a great explanation, Tien. Thank you. So it's interesting. So I have Tien and I have his coach. So now a very good self-assessment. So Rich, then let me go back to you again with those three pillars: the vision, the execution, relationship. What could prevent a founder? A founder comes to you, and I'm sure like you get the buy-in with the data. Okay, it's not opinion. It's not some psychological mumbo jumbo baloney. You buy in; these people respect the data. So what would prevent a founder? Again, Tien was very open saying, I've got better at, okay, when a relationship is the one you had to work on the most. It's not your strongest quality, but you've gotten better at it and you have a better awareness. Okay, even how you participate in meetings, et cetera. So then, Rich, what prevents with your clients when you're talking to them, and I'm sure you can sense it pretty quickly, that they're not going to embrace the process. They're not going to overcome the hurdle, and they are careening towards it being a ticking time bomb.
Yeah. Well, I can see it in their behavior in the meetings, but I can also see it in the data. I mean, when I look at adaptability and openness to input, if that's low, I know I'm going to have a struggle with somebody. And if in the meeting they're telling me all the reasons why they're right, and why the data is wrong, then that's usually a pretty good sign. Let's talk about narcissism for a second. I mean, most leaders are narcissistic to a degree. They have the chutzpah, to Sanskrit term, to believe that somebody's going to give millions of dollars and follow them, in a very uncertain, high-risk situation. So you got to have a certain amount of risk-taking, but you also have to be pretty confident. But when that gets extreme and the person needs people to worship them, and they create a reality distortion zone, where everybody is overlooking their behavior, and their behavior is bad behavior. And it'll show up often in, they throw tantrums when they don't get what they want, or when people are not giving it to them fast enough. So there's a level of extreme self-centeredness. And in the unsuccessful group, I mean, there's some narcissism and self-centeredness in all founders, but there's a lot more of it in the unsuccessful group. And that's part of the reason they fail, because they make bad decisions. No one will challenge them. The other thing that's really interesting is that all founders are impatient and have a sense of urgency. But the unsuccessful are impulsive. and the successful are more deliberate, and they monitor themselves more. They
So
may be impatient.
Managed urgency, not impulsiveness.
Managed urgency, not reactivity.
Right.
I mean, if it'll get in the way in their hiring decisions. They'll meet somebody, and the first 30 seconds, they've decided this is my kind of person. They don't pay attention to the data. They say, I have this intuitive sense. My gut is usually right. And they believe that. And they tell me, my gut is right. Red flag.
Well, Tim, like you started with the story of how it was my investor, my venture capitalist, Peter Fenton, that introduced us. So you can imagine one of Rich's biggest demands on a client basis actually comes from the VC community, because that's the big question. That's the big question the venture capitalists have, right? This founder that we invested in, are they going to be able to go the distance, or are they going to blow up?
Right.
And Rich does have the insights to be able to determine that, fairly accurately and fairly quickly.
Okay, so here's some fun questions. And again, this has been a terrific conversation. Again, today's guests are the co-authors of Founders Keepers: Why Founders Are Built to Fail and What It Takes to Succeed. Again, it's been great to have the duo on today. Tien, let me put you on the hot seat for a moment. What makes Rich a great coach? I'm assuming he's a great coach because you've been with him for 15 years.
Yeah. Look, there's quite a lot of things, right? Rich is a founder himself, so it takes one to know one. And so, in the course of this conversation, we made sort of comments where I can see from your facial expression, Tim, that it certainly resonates with you. So I suspect, as a founder of your firm and your podcast, right, this is all group therapy in some sense. But what I loved about what Rich does is it's so data oriented, right? And so there's really no escape, which can be uncomfortable at first, but when you really start to embrace it, there's tools that you have that you can see yourself. And certainly the interpretation of the tools of the data is important. Rich is there as your guide to interpret the data for you, to bring it out through experiences and other founders and other executives that he's worked with. And then for every one of these competencies, Rich has a path, right? Rich has a path that says, look, here's some techniques and tools. If this is the competency that you have to work on, here's some frameworks to go about it. And that's how we try to structure the book, right? To really spend some time understanding what is a founder. But then the second half of the book are practical tools to solve what we think are 10 of the most common leadership gaps. Some of them, I've gone through. And so I try to share my stories in that context. And so we really can have a dialogue, if you will, of coach and patient and founder, and how we work through these things as a practical guide. But I would say for Rich, he's absolutely one of the best coaches. I talk to other founders who have different types of coaches. What Rich does is really, really unique. And it comes back to the fact that it's very, very data driven.
So Rich, again, I like to think that founders who've created some of the world's biggest brands and products and services, Tien being one of them with the subscription economy and what that's done, is there a possibility, or have you ever considered, Rich, that you could potentially coach founders out of their secret sauce?
That was actually one of Peter's concerns. Yeah, that was actually one of Peter's concerns. And I remember, especially in the early years when the three of us got together, Peter's point, and you can see that in the intro in his book, is I think, Rich, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you really focus almost exclusively on founders over the last decade. And there is a sense that, look, we're not trying to make founders look like other leaders, right? We're trying to have them keep their secret sauce, but amplify and enhance, or amplify their strengths, enhance their gaps, help them build awareness of it. And there are some lessons when Rich talked about. One of the most important things is hiring. You've got to surround yourself with people that complement your visionary skills. And that's one of the things that you have to do if you're going to go the distance.
Interesting. So that was a concern of Peter, obviously, when he initially introduced you. Rich, as the coach, have you ever considered that or thought that could be some collateral damage sometimes?
Generally, those skills, the creative insights and the ability to inspire and persuade and are necessary for all leaders to have to some degree. But as a company gets bigger and starts to scale, you need to bring in somebody who has really got leadership, all the elements of leadership, vision, relationship, and execution. Maybe they're a little lighter on the vision. But I really think if you're a founder and you want to be the exception to the rule, you have to find a way to utilize your strengths and the things you're good at, and bring in people who complement you, and ask yourself, given my strengths, what's the best and highest use of my time? And not spend it doing things that are unnatural to you. I also think that there comes a time when a founder may realize that the company needs a leader who they're never going to be. And maybe it's time to become a serial founder and start another one. And we do know that the research that's been done on success shows that although only 10% of all founders are ever successful, the number is dramatically higher for those who have been previous founders and had a previous journey. They're a little better at it. I think what I'm saying is you got to face the fact that maybe you either need to change your role, which is hard for a founder to do. Could be to move to chairman. Rarely it would be to become the CTO, but that doesn't usually work. And maybe the best solution is to look for an exit, and go do it again. And I think so many people come to me and they say, I'm going to be the exception to the rule. And we know statistically that almost none of them will be.
There's that ego.
They got to It's ego. Yeah, I'm going to be the exception.
Amazing. Listen, gentlemen, I want to thank you for the conversation. The book itself was a very, very interesting read. As I was reading it, I was writing notes in the margins of some of my own clients who are founders, and I was kind of chuckling and seeing them apply to the very pages and thoughts that you're sharing. So let me wrap it this way. Beyond the leaders who are listening, buying the book, because it's a great read. It's a must read if you're a founder. Beyond that, I'll throw it out to either one of you, because you both have, you earned a lot, the respect of a lot of people doing what you do as coaches and founders. One thought for a struggling founder today listening. What wisdom would you like to part?
Yeah, I have a couple of things. Let go of control and learn to work through other people. What got you here isn't going to get you there. You're going to have to change your leadership. You're going to have to learn to delegate and work through others. And you got to work on your emotional intelligence and your interpersonal skills. All of that comes with more self-awareness, because they all have blind spots. We all have blind spots.
Sure. Well said. Thank you, Rich. Tien, what about you?
Look, I would want to speak. I do have a chance to work with a lot of earlier stage founders, and certainly, talk a lot to my peers. I would try to appeal to why you want to found something in the first place, right? And if you want your vision to have the biggest impact it can have, to bring the biggest life that it can have, then how do you scale? How do you scale, and how do you achieve your objectives? And what are you good at as a founder? What you're probably good as a founder is starting from a clean slate. So apply that to yourself, right? Just start from a clean slate. Use Rich's framework, right? It's all in the book, to do a self-assessment, a self-inventory of what you're good at. What do you have to be better at? You can certainly do a 360 as well, but then apply that founder's instinct and that spirit of innovation to your own leadership style. And when you do that, it can be an inspiring experience. It can be a great path for personal growth. And ultimately, the reason you started the whole thing in the first place, yes, there was certainly something about independence, right? Not wanting to work for somebody and being able to call the shots, but ultimately you've got a vision that you're trying to get out there, whether it's a software company, whether it's a consulting firm, whether it's a podcast, right? Whatever it happens to be, and just stay true to the spirit of that, and understand that, as always, it's a journey.
Awesome. Gentlemen, listen, I want to thank you for sharing your time, sharing your wisdom, sharing the book. Again, the book, Founders Keepers. We have the co-authors, Richard Hagberg and Tien Tzuo. And just a really great conversation on checking the ego at the door for founders, and everything from delegation, the importance and the power of hiring the right people. I mean, what you guys have shared today has really been phenomenal. So thank you for your generosity, and thank you for your time, and much success on the book.
Of course, Tim. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. And this, of course, has been the Profit Express. Again, special thanks to our guests today, the co-authors of Founders Keepers. And when the book came across my desk, I knew it was the kind of book I wanted to have on the show because, A, I have many of my own clients who are founders. And of course, there are many listeners and fans of the Profit Express who are founders who can absolutely 100% relate to the message. So if you are a founder, hey, if you know somebody who's a founder, if you love somebody who's a founder, go out and buy the book, read the book. This is the Profit Express. Until next time, let's keep winning the battle for business.